All right, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to begin today's discussion with a little coverage of something new, which is how to do caching using Spring. So if you take a look at this article, which is from a website called Baldung, it's a Spring cache tutorial, and it talks about what caching is and how to enable it with Spring. So very, very briefly here, caching is a mechanism of moving the data closer to the user, to the client. It's typically used in the context of Spring in order to be able to cache the results of relatively long-running database computations and then store the results in a magic way on the server side, so when subsequent calls come along, they don't actually have to go through the process of doing the database operation. So that's the basic idea. There's other types of caching mechanisms where you can try to cache the data on the client side. We're not going to talk about those right now. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example that I've updated to introduce caching. So this is the WebMVC EX4 example. We talked about this quite a while back with the use of the JPA mechanisms in order to be able to do database queries to get back quotes from Zippy the Pinhead. If you recall, we had this thing that was the Zippy microservice, Zippy service. And here's the method we're going to work with. This is called get all quotes. And the purpose of this method, as you can see, is to come in and get access to all the quotes that are Zippy quotes in the repository. So it does a find all operation. Not the world's most heavy-duty database query, but it'll be useful for our purposes. And you'll see, just for kicks here, I added a sleep that will cause it to block for 4 seconds before returning the results. So that's what the server side looks like to start with. Then over here on the client side, we have the client quote driver, and the client quote driver is going to call the time Zippy quotes caching method. And what that's going to do is it's going to go ahead and make a call to the quote client proxy, which will get all the quotes for the Zippy service. And it's going to do it twice. It's going to make the first call to get all quotes, time how long that takes to run. Then it's going to make the second call to time all quotes, time how long that takes to run. So that's the basic model here. Let's go over here and we'll shut down the Zippy microservice and then restart it so it's up and running. And then we'll run the client. And what we should expect to see here is, because we have that 4-second delay and no caching to start with, both calls should take over 4 seconds to run. And we'll take a look and see if that's actually what happens. So to do that, we come up here and we click on the quote driver, and we go ahead and make the call. And you'll see that what will happen is it'll go ahead and make the call. It takes, again, a few seconds to compile the program, and then it should take about 8 seconds or so to run the thing, because it's going to block waiting for the calls to return, emulating a slow-running server. And you can see here that indeed the first call took this long to run, the second call took that long to run. They both took over 4 seconds to run. That's the key thing to note from that. OK, so now let's go over here back to the Zippy service, and let's enable caching. So this is actually quite simple. All you need to do in order to enable caching with Spring Boot is turn on the caching mechanism by adding the enable caching annotation to the application, the microservice we're trying to enable caching for. So we do that. So that's going to be enabled. And then we come over here and we add the @cacheable Zippy cache annotation. So @cacheable is the annotation that tells Spring, I want to cache this service. This is the service method, the implementation method. And I want you to store it in a cache called Zippy cache. And we can choose whatever we want. I probably should not use symbolic. I should probably use a symbolic constant here, not a string literal, but I was just trying to get it to work. So that's what we've got for the moment. OK, so now we've turned on caching. So we can go back over here and shut down our Zippy application that did not have caching. And now we're going to restart it again with caching enabled for that particular method. And so that'll start up and run here in a second. And once that's up and running, we will rerun the client application and see what, if anything, changes. So let's go ahead and run the quote driver. So now we've got caching enabled for the microservice, as well as we've got the cacheable annotation on the getAllQuotes method. And you should see when this runs, we'll see the results of the caching in just a moment. And boom, look at that. So the first call to getAllQuotes took, again, about a little bit over 4.5 seconds. But the second call didn't even go into the service method at all. It just read the data right out of the cache. So it executed much, much more efficiently because it took it from the cache. Now, whether this is actually a benefit or not is going to depend heavily on whether the computation that is being done is the blocking factor, is the actual long pole in the tent, or whether there's some other reason why it's taking a while to run. And it might be just getting access to all the data and copying it back from the server to the client. So if that's a long-running thing, the caching will help a little bit, but it may not actually be a huge boon. But in this particular case, you could see it improve things because we had a sleep in there. So of course, it was going to be faster. So that's doing caching at sort of the whole enchilada level. You can also enable caching in a more fine-grained way. And in that case, what you can do is you can do something like this, where you can enable caching on a per-key basis. So in this case, we would use the Zippy cache, except we would cache it on a per-key basis, which would be, in this case, a given quote ID. So if you ran this thing, the first time you looked up something that was a given quote ID, it would not be in the cache, so it would go here and make this method call. And then the subsequent times that you did that, it would go ahead and read that data out of the cache. Now, there's also a bunch of other methods that you can use. I haven't really shown them in my example because they didn't really warrant them, but there's also ways of doing cache eviction. If you're going to update something, you can also put things into the cache to update just the particular element, and so on and so forth. So it might be worthwhile taking a look at this article. It gives you a little bit of an overview of the bigger picture view of caching in Spring Boot. But I wanted you to be aware of this because for the next programming assignment, you have to do this for one of the methods.